There's 785 games you'll miss without this. Let's talk about it. Today we're having a discussion about one of Sega Genesis' 5th generation consoles, the Sega Saturn. There were over 1,000 games produced for this system and 785 Japanese exclusives. What that means is for us that are over in the US that we didn't get a chance to play almost 3/4 of the library of this system. Now for those of you who grew up with the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation as well as this system right here, we have a different experience with the 5th generation because that was the generation where 2D was transitioning over into 3D. Even if you're a newer gamer or if you're a gamer from my generation and never experienced the Sega Saturn, I believe it's very important to look back and check out this generation of games because they just felt different, they looked different, and I'll explain more about that in the video. This video idea came about when I was thinking about a topic that's readily being discussed, and that is the digital takeover of gaming. In that transition, certain consoles such as the Sega Saturn are harder to emulate because of the way their architecture and their hardware was designed. What that means is literally 785 games are locked into this system, and whether you buy a Steam Deck or whatever, you're gonna have to spend big bucks in order to play these games unless you have one of these. Also, from a historical standpoint, emulation is going to have to be a necessity of the future, but certain consoles like this are very hard to emulate because of the amount of processors and the architecture that was developed. So systems like the Steam Deck are powerful enough to play these games, but at the same token, everybody doesn't have Steam Deck money just to play the library of Sega Saturn. So I typed out a couple topics. We're going to talk about the gameplay, the Japanese exclusives of the Sega Saturn. We're also going to talk about the experience and power that this console has, the unique architecture, the FPGA and mini consoles that are possible in the future, and also cheap media for re-release. Okay, so what I want to start with is the evolution of the generations from the 4th and 5th. And for gamers out there who may not know, the 4th generation is your Super Nintendo, your Sega Genesis, your TurboGrafx 16. And 5th generation is the predecessor after, which is your Sega Saturns, your Nintendo 64, and your PlayStation 1s. Now, this era is very important to focus on. Whether you're a new gamer or an old head, you have to pay attention to this generation because this is the transition from 2D games to 3D games. Also, that these particular games didn't have remakes from one generation to the next. So a lot of the games that came on Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn were actually new IP. Coming from the 4th generation, Sony PlayStation didn't have a previous system. So everything, for the most part, whether it was a collection that was offered from other companies or exclusive games on the PlayStation 1, were all new. Now, same thing with Sega Saturn. They had some collections for Sega Saturn, but most of the IPs were new. And in Nintendo 64, it had the smallest library in this era. Just looking at the numbers, the Sega Saturn had 1,046 games in total with 785 Japanese exclusives. What that means is that there were only 261 US releases. The PlayStation 1 has 7,918 games in total, almost 8,000 games. And the Nintendo 64 only had 388 games with 85 Japanese exclusives. Now when I think about these numbers, I'm looking at the fact of the Nintendo 64 has a much smaller library, but most of those games were carried over from the previous generations. So if you had a Zelda back then, you just had a newer polygon Zelda. If you had a Donkey Kong, same thing. When you got newer games, it was like Banjo-Kazooie. Those type of games were new IPs. So to really think about it, the Sega Saturn had very unique games that were only available in Japan. Alright, let's talk about the sales for the Sega Saturn in and of itself. Now, I believe that the Sega Saturn will be a great candidate for FPGA, and mainly because of the number. Sega Saturn was released in 1994 in Japan and in 1995 worldwide. On release, the Sega Saturn sold for $399 retail. The system was discontinued in 1998, which means that the system only existed in support for about 3 years. So think about that. You got over 1,000 games that only had really 3 years of a lifespan, and that's a lot of games to be missed over. You had 3 million units sold in the US alone and 9.26 million worldwide. So there is a large base of people that have actually played the Sega Saturn when it launched. I think if there was a company like Limited Run Games to re-release the Sega Saturn games, not only the games but an FPGA system. I know that there's the Polymega that's out, but the Polymega is sort of expensive, and then you have to buy all the attachments. So an exclusive PGA Sega Saturn along with the 1,000 games would be great to be released in the US. It's like releasing a brand new console all over again, and I think the first company to do that will make a killing. I wanted to go over a few misconceptions about the Sega Saturn. It wasn't that the Sega Saturn was not a great console. In actuality, it was the most powerful console within the 5th generation. Go over some of the specs. The Sega Saturn had 8 total processors, 2 GPUs, and it was considered a difficult architecture to develop games for. The media was CD-ROMs, VCDs, mini CDs, ebooks as well. It also had 2 Hitachi SH2s that ran at 28.6 megahertz. It also had 2 megabytes of RAM, expandable to 512 gigabytes. And also the graphics, it had 2 graphics processors, a VDP1 and a VDP2. And I think the VDP1s and 2s were known for the arcade machines, like the racing games and the shooting games that Sega had. So a lot of people may not have known that the Sega Saturn was online capable through the Sega Netlink. Just to note, I have my Sega Saturn set up with the Action Replay backup. This allows me to play region free, so I can play any games around the country, and I can also play backup games. You can see right here I have a backup on the inside. But this setup, when I got it for a steal. And I also have it set up with 2 wireless controllers and also an HDMI out cable. So I've got all the bells and whistles that can really upgrade an older console like this. So in my opinion, currently the best way to play Sega Saturn, since you can still get these available anywhere in the range of 40 bucks upwards of $200, $250. I honestly think that even though CD technology has more mechanical parts, what's surprising about this is how old these consoles are. Some of these consoles like this are over 20 years old, yet the CD-ROM still works. So what if they made an FPGA where maybe you could replace the CD-ROM lens inside very easily? I think that would be a great solution for an FPGA Sega Saturn. I wanted to talk about some Sega IPs that became new to this generation or more familiar. That is your Symphony of the Night, your Nights into Dreams, your Panzer Dragoons, Virtua Fighter, and Saturn Bomber. These are the more common games that gave the Sega Saturn more shine. But what about these games right here? Linkle Liver Story, Astra Superstars, Princess Crown, Baroque, Wizardry Nemesis. And I'll go through and you can check out some of the visuals on these games here. So now you can see there are so many games that came out for the Saturn in Japan that the US market never saw. So that's about 800 games that may go kaput, never gone, only for a few people that may have the Sega Saturn console or can emulate it. So my proposal is games like this and systems like this, where there's a bit of time locked in history, I think they need to create an FPGA, or they need to offer some sort of emulation solution for almost 800 games that most of us would never really have a chance to play, and they're great games. So I think that the Sega Saturn will be a great candidate for an FPGA console. Keep in mind that a lot of these games that I discussed and showed in this video will never be carried over into digital, or it will never be carried over into the next generation. Majority of these games were lost and never went to the Sega Dreamcast because the Sega Dreamcast wasn't out long enough. So that lets you know that this 5th generation era had a lot of crazy cool games that need to be explored. So guys, what do you think about the Sega Saturn? If you're a Nintendo or PlayStation head, are there some games on the list that interested you and that you might want to try out? So definitely check out a lot of these Sega Saturn games. So I'll be doing more on the Sega Saturn on this channel and investigating more of the games, the history, and maybe why you should give it a try. Guys, I really appreciate you tuning in. Drop a comment in the comment section below. If you would like to support the channel, there's Macari and also other support links in the description. And I also appreciate you tuning in and allowing me to bring these videos to you. Guys, take care, do some gaming, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care, guys.